Well, Tom, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm looking forward to talking with you about data products and data product strategy as a component of some of the emerging technology, that we're seeing in data analytics and artificial intelligence and whatnot. Now, I've been looking at some of your recent papers and research. You've been doing work for like AWS and publishing stuff, of course, as you always do on the MIT and Harvard Business Review. And you've been talking about, I think recently, like within the last month or two, pieces I've seen have been around data product strategy. And can you start us off? Can you describe a little bit, what a data product strategy is?
Sure. Well, I guess I should first say what a data product is. And there's a little bit of maybe not controversy, but disagreement about that topic. I always thought of data products as the combination of data and the tools that you need to accomplish something specific with it, which usually turns out to be analytics and AI, the ways we make sense of data. But there are some people and organizations that argue a data product is just the data itself, and they might refer to an analytics product or an AI product. But to me, data by itself isn't terribly useful. So I like the idea of a data product being both the data that you're using and the tools that you need to make sense of it or get some value out of it. And then, so a data product strategy is things like which data products are you going to develop? What is the business purpose of them? Who's going to do it? What are the different capabilities that you have to have as an organization, including data product managers, which I think we'll talk about at some point. There are a number of other groups that are necessary to make data products ultimately successful. So that's a big issue. And I think those are the basic things. There aren't that many companies yet who have data product strategies because a lot of people are saying, okay, we're going to decide on what analytics or AI use cases we're going to develop, and we're just going to call them data products. But I do think that just as companies who produce things for their customers have product strategies, it makes sense to have data product strategies.
So it's really, it sounds like, and I hope I'm not off base here, but it sounds like it's kind of productizing context and being able to look across and creating kind of a more holistic solution. So like you have the data, you have other raw data, and then, you're making sense of it, but then applying that sense that's being made and then productizing that and selling that to the market. Is that fair? Is that?
Yeah, except that it may not be sold externally. It might just be for an internal purpose. Those are often called data products too. So maybe I want to do a better job of assessing my risk under certain circumstances. So you could have a risk-oriented data product, or you could have a marketing data product to produce recommendations, or some companies I've worked with have created these next best action data products. So I think when data products were initially discussed, it was in digital native companies, mostly in Silicon Valley. And for them, it was typically, something that you take to customers and sell, or at least give away with the intention of getting eyeballs and selling something else. But within legacy companies, it could be just an internal application or something for customers.
Now, I think, so in concert with this, we're seeing the rise of the chief data officer. And it's a fairly recent phenomenon among the C-suite. I think within the last 20 years, I think is what I had seen. And I know largely, or I suspect largely, really was emergent in like the financial sector, because there's a lot of, anti-money laundering and data privacy and a lot of things where data just naturally lent itself to the risk of the institution. And so they were looking at it. The board was like kind of demanding greater governance over data. Anyway, that said, you recently authored a report for AWS on chief data officers and prioritizing business value creation. Now, how do you see data products folding into the efforts of the CDOs to create value for their organizations?
Yeah, well, they're, I think, a key element of creating value. In general, it's hard being a chief data officer if you don't have responsibility for analytics and AI and even business intelligence is
Mm-hmm.
a tough job because data is kind of an abstraction to many people. They don't fully understand what's right or wrong about it, how to make it better, et cetera. So many chief data officers have become chief data and analytics officers. They've taken responsibility for both the supply of data, but also the demand in terms of analytics and AI and business intelligence to, make sense of it and use it in the business. The problem has been that we started out, I wrote an article about a decade ago with a person who ended up being the first chief data scientist of the United States, DJ Patil, in Harvard Business Review. And nobody remembers the title of that article, but they remember the subtitle. It was called Data Scientist, Sexiest Job of the 21st Century.
Oh, yeah.
And the problem is, I don't know, maybe we created a little bit of a monster, but the problem is companies thought, well, okay, I'll put data scientists in charge of the whole process of producing valuable things with analytics and AI. And it turns out many of those data scientists aren't really interested in anything but creating a great model. They love the manipulating the numbers and the models in order to get high area under the curve percentages and so on. And so many of those models just never got deployed in organizations. And there were various surveys about the percentage of models that got deployed, 13% in one study. Some of the companies I've talked to said we never deploy any of them. We create them, but they never get deployed. So data products obviously don't work if you're not deploying something. It's kind of like you came up with an idea for a new product, but a new form of toothpaste, but you never introduced it to any customers, so you never got any value. And that was the problem in the data science space. So pretty critical, I think, for chief data officers, if they're going to get value, to take an approach that says, okay, we're going to fully deploy this model into production, and we're going to get economic value, and we're going to even monitor it over time in case the model, drifts or doesn't predict as well anymore. And all of those things, I mean, not every chief data officer has embraced this idea, or chief data and analytics officer, but I think in our survey, 39% said they were working with data products and were moving toward using data product managers.
That's interesting. And I can't help but think that it's somewhat analogous in some ways with, like, a lot of times you see innovation efforts within corporations. There's a lot of like energy to like stand up innovation efforts, but then they don't necessarily get productized, or they don't have demonstrable value. It's, it's a culture thing, but it's like, you've got to have somebody who can help get it through the pipeline and get it out the door. And I know we'll touch on that here in a minute when we talk about data product managers, but
yeah, exactly. Same sort of thing. We think of products as being developed by R&D people or something like that, but you have to have a very cross-functional approach. If you're going to bring a product to market, it's got to involve marketing and sales and supply chain and so on. And so what a lot of product-focused companies have done have created this overlay of the product manager. Those are increasingly popular in software companies too, whose job it is to look at the entire process and make sure that it makes it to market, and that it's what the customers want, and that it's successful.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, so kind of to that point, how should an organization productize its data? And what are maybe just a couple of examples of that come to mind?
Typically you're taking some collection of data that you think is useful for a particular purpose and combining it, as I say, with some data, with some analytics or AI or maybe business intelligence. So it might be something, if you're talking about a company that is in the business of data products. I once asked the chief economist, Halvarian of Google, how many data products do you have? And he said, okay, I want you to go to the website for Google and the Wikipedia page for Google, and it lists all of our products. And I want you to count them all. And that will be the number of data products that we have, because everything we do is a data product, basically. And so, when I wrote about this a number of years ago, and I talked about things like LinkedIn, people you may know. Facebook also has a people you may know. It's some combination of a sort of a social graph with the social graph data that you have within the organization, and then something that does matching. So you can tell people, okay, you probably know this person since you know this other person, and that person knows this person well. So chances are pretty good we'll sort of make a triangle out of it. And you might want to connect with them, because that's going to make the site more valuable. It turns out people you may know was a very successful offering for LinkedIn. I think we're all kind of bored with it now, but for a while it was really quite exciting. Or, it might be something as simple as patient dashboard in a healthcare institution where you can quickly see, what the state of their body is along various dimensions. So it doesn't have to be anything exotic. It's just a set of data and some way of making it meaningful.
Now, I think to that end, you have put forward or you have been writing about recently, I should say, the concept of reusable data sets. How does that fit into, this discussion around data products? Like what are reusable data sets, and how do they, what part do they play?
Well, in general, I think we've sort of not done terribly well on the data management side. We've kind of focused on earlier stages of the data supply chain, like how do we collect this data, how do we store it, and so on, and not enough on consumption. So if you care about consumption, you need to kind of package up data sets, collections of data, maybe involving a set of different variables or data elements, and say, okay, all of these are useful for accomplishing this particular purpose. I was talking with someone from AT&T recently, and they were saying, hey, if you want to study churn, we've got a set of different churn data sets for different markets, and then we've got the churn model that you can kind of plug into with an API. So if you're interested in preventing a particular type of customer from leaving us, we're going to make it very easy for you to do that. So the reusable data, I think, goes quite well with the reusable features, or if you're talking about machine learning, or variables if you're talking about traditional analytics, same thing actually. But everything you need in order to do this analysis is available, and we're going to make it possible for almost anybody to do this kind of analysis. So the reusable data sets might involve customers, might involve products, it might involve particular regions. There are all sorts of combinations, and I think maybe we're going to talk about this later on, but I think it could also involve external data, and probably it should involve external data.
Yeah, because I think that, given that data sets train the AIs, and there's like so much emphasis now on training sets and, growing that, it just seems to me that there's an opportunity there to cross-pollinate with other organizations. If you can get around the data privacy concerns and that sort of thing, and then, maybe there's got to be some interesting ways that organizations can collaborate and help their AIs muscle up.
Yeah. I mean, just for an example, in banking, everybody's interested in not only how much money of this particular customer do I manage, but what's my share of wallet?
Mm-hmm.
And to do that, you really have to have some sort of collaboration with other banks to say, okay, let's share data to some degree anyway, maybe through a third party. It often is the case through a third party, so that you can see, well, you have 20% of their assets, but
Mm-hmm.
these four other institutions have percentages as well. And, might be an opportunity for you to gain some share. Or, there's some data that's just much more likely to be generated externally, like weather data, for example. Weather data is quite useful in, predicting what things you might want to buy.
Mm-hmm.
I looked at one company where they did those lenses that turn dark in the sunlight,
Mm-hmm.
transitions lenses, and obviously weather plays a big role in that. So if you have a really rainy summer, people
Mm-hmm.
aren't going to buy as many, sunglasses. So weather data is usually it was supplied by the National Weather Service, but now, IBM bought a weather company. A number of companies are getting into supplying weather data. AccuWeather does it too. So external data, I think, is generally a little overlooked by many
Mm-hmm.
companies, and I think it's a good idea to apply it when you can.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I mean, just not to get off track, but it's like that. That makes me think of like supply chain implications. For like going to your transition lens. If I'm a transition, if that is a part of my product portfolio, and I know that it's going to be an exceedingly rainy season, and I don't need to buy X amount of components, I need to buy Y, and I need to adjust my supply chain, and then there's like downstream implications to all of that. So. Um,
Yeah, a lot of companies now are interested in, not only what things might be going on with their suppliers, but they're trying to look further up the chain and say, well, what about my suppliers? And
yeah.
are there floods where they're producing? Is there political unrest? Maybe something is happening. So my supplier hasn't had a problem yet, but they will.
Mhm.
So you can really anticipate a lot more what's happening. Obviously, we should have done better about that during COVID than
Oh
we
yeah.
did.
Yeah. Well, there you go. You live and learn. So, now you mentioned earlier, when we're talking about data product strategy, and you mentioned, the digital natives, Silicon Valley, they're really kind of the leading on this, but that like maybe, I don't know, more traditional is like the right nomenclature here, but, more traditional companies, large companies that are trying to make this shift towards data products. Can you talk about maybe some of the challenges that you found among large companies who are trying to implement, a data product strategy?
The ones that have really embraced it seem to be doing pretty well with it, but probably the biggest complaint is, it's hard to find the right kind of people, because data scientists, for the reasons I was discussing earlier, generally are not the best at it, because they tend to be focused on building great models and algorithms. But some, data scientists might be okay at it if they, are willing to take this big picture and not have to use their highly analytical skills every minute of the day. But you have to know something about analytics and AI. You have to understand something about data structures and different types of data. You have to be a good communicator, because you're really coordinating across this broad spectrum of cross-functional activities. You have to be knowledgeable about what customers in your industry want, because producing products that appeal to customers is a big part of your success. So it's hard to find people with all of those attributes who are available. There are no, I think I'm working with one university that's starting to create data product managers, but in general, there aren't any
Like
close
programs around that, like
topic.
academic programs that like help. Yeah, because you've articulated this as like a new role, that it's not the data scientist, but it's like somebody who's maybe, like you just said, they have that domain expertise around AI and analytics, but then also they're able to wear the hat of a product manager. They understand marketing. They understand the big picture of like what it takes to like put something together and all the constituent parts and bring it to market.
Exactly. Yeah, and there was one related role that people have been talking about for a while,
Hmm.
the sort of analytics translator role. And there was I'd written some stuff about this, but never really about. I call them purple people, kind of half red, half blue, half technical, half business oriented. But a McKinsey article in Harvard Business Review, I think, used a new term, the analytics translator,
Hmm.
and a number of companies have experimented with that. But my guess is that data product managers also are capable of translation, and they do a lot more.
Hmm.
And their value is a lot easier to establish than just translation. So I think it'll ultimately be a more popular role than the translator role was.
Let me ask you, kind of going back a little bit on the idea of data privacy, and I know that was obviously a big concern, particularly in 2018 with the release of the GDPR and its lingering effects. But do you see data privacy concerns creating any significant barriers for the deployment of a data product strategy? And if so, how are those overcome so that value is not lost?
I think that you could be yet another thing that you make data product managers responsible for, that there are privacy safeguards in place, and that you have to have somebody to to point to when something goes wrong, and data product manager would certainly suffice for that. If you're in healthcare, you can have an overall person who is responsible for HIPAA compliance, for example, but you really need somebody who's close to the individual applications or use cases, and that's going to be the data product managers. So I think it can help more than hurt. I mean, obviously, data privacy can be a difficult thing to address, and I'm not saying it makes the job easier for data product managers, but it does make dealing with data privacy somewhat easier if you have a structure in place for data product management.
Okay. Circling back to what we were discussing about the concept of collaborative organizations, can productized data be combined, with other organizations' data to expand its value? And have you seen any particularly interesting examples of that?
Yeah, well, a lot of companies now are trying to look at it may violate some people's idea of data privacy, but they're trying to sort of track their customers across a variety of different platforms. Their internal platforms, but also social media and loyalty programs and so on. And so
Mhm.
you have a class of companies emerging that do that. I mean, we always had third party data brokers, but now they are working across channels in many cases. And if you want to get a sense of is this person who appeared on your website somebody who has bought a lot from other companies in the industry in the past or whatever, you're
Mhm.
only going to get that through a third party provider. So that'd be one example. And I think the number of potential external data suppliers is really endless. Location data, health data, and I think driving data. A lot of the automobile companies now have connected vehicle data. There's going to be even more of that in the past as cars become more electric and autonomous and so on. So there are going to be fantastic opportunities, as long as you don't annoy your customers too much, to take advantage of all that external data that's available.
That's interesting. Yeah, I had spoken years before with, he was the chief digital officer for a European car manufacturer. And I think one of the things they were trying to do is get to like this kind of personalized digital memory. So like basically you create this profile as a driver, and then whenever you like rented a car, you're traveling, and wherever you rented a car, like you had a key fob or something, it would regardless of where you were in the world, if you rented one of their electric and autonomous vehicles, it would remember like your Netflix, preferences and logins and like all your social media and like everything. So it like extended beyond just like memory of, well, this is like how you like your seat, and the ergonomics and all that kind of thing, to like where it was like your whole digital life followed you in your whatever vehicle. And it wasn't just your vehicle, but like any vehicle that you rented from them across the world, which, is interesting, but it was kind of like, wow, that's, again, data privacy, it's like that might be a head scratcher for some people, but.
Yeah, I wrote an article recently. It hasn't been published yet. I don't think it's in one of these management journals with a long lead time, but it's on AI and personalization.
Mm-hmm.
And so I reviewed some of the literature on what consumers think about personalization. And turns out they're very schizophrenic about it. They want it if it can, save them a lot of money or save them a lot of time or bring them free goods or discounted goods or whatever. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, they don't want to give up their data in order to make it possible. So it's a little hard to know sort of where the line is. But I do think that having your customers' permission is increasingly important, and providing some sort of value exchange. Okay, I'm going to use your data, but I'm going to give you something valuable in exchange for it. Like, I use Gmail as my email client. I know they sort of look at my data on occasion. It's never really bothered me all that much, although now I notice there's some things that I get that I can't declare spam. They just keep coming day after day. So maybe at some point I'll tire of it. But for a number of years, it's been a good value exchange for me. And I still don't get very well personalized offers from them because of it.
Well, and I've heard that, I think there's a desire to see like personal data get monetized so that people can make, it's like, okay, if you're going to use my data, then what's in it for me, like you're saying. And so
monetized being the owner of that data is the individual from whence it came, and they get some money. Unfortunately, a lot of companies, when they talk about monetization, it's how do we make money off our customers' data. And that, I think, is not really ultimately going to succeed. And in fact, I even tell companies, don't use that term monetization. If your customers hear it, unless it's providing money for them, which is hardly ever the case, they're going to be annoyed.
Yeah, but I do think there are data advocates out there, and I've talked to some commentators that think that might be coming, where it's not, the monetization goes back to the person. So it's like I get monetized for you, Acme Incorporated, using my data, so.
Yeah. Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the web, is working on some products that would allow that. Sandy Pentland at MIT, a friend of mine, has argued for that. There's a new venture by Frank McCourt, who used to own the LA Dodgers, called Project Liberty, where they're trying to create that. But it's kind of a hard row to hoe. It's a lot of change necessary in how the internet and the web works to make these things happen. And I hope it does. I think we need some changes, but I don't see it happening quickly.
Well, yeah, and there's going to probably be countervailing forces that like try to get around that, but so we shall see. Well, Tom, I do have a couple of questions that have been submitted from our audience. Pretty fascinating, just kind of like a little bit off topic from data products, but they are, these are questions around AI and data sets and data science. So if you're game, I'd like to just ask you a couple and get your take on this. So the first one comes from Dr. Jen Bloom of Germany, and she writes, are there any current IT trends that you view as fads, such as, trends that you think are getting a lot of hype but won't necessarily enact meaningful change?
Yeah, I guess I'd put the metaverse in that category. And I was skeptical about it all along, not just because Meta and Facebook have fallen upon hard times recently. I just didn't really think that the technology was yet up to the task and of, making a highly engaging visual experience for consumers. And I guess I was also a little bit skeptical about Web3 and cryptocurrency. I do think that it and the blockchain will play some role in the future. But, it's one of the things that's amazing to me is this is supposed to be such an appealing technology because your assets are secured on the blockchain, yet everybody gets hacked. I just don't quite get how that works. Clearly a bit of a contradiction there. And so I think the recent, over the last few days, vanishing of this very large and once successful crypto exchange, FTX, is going to put another short-term nail in the coffin of Web3. I don't think we're going to talk about it nearly as much as we have over the last couple of years.
Yeah, it seems like, there's been a lot of talk about blockchain and cryptocurrencies for the last several years, but it just hasn't replaced currency as we know it. Tales of the death of the dollar are greatly exaggerated. So we'll see.
If it has replaced your currency, then you have a lot less currency than you had a few months ago.
Oh, wow. Okay, so our next question comes from Noah Pakinis of London, and he writes, what is the most eye-opening realization about AI today?
Well, this turns out to be a very good question, Noah, because today I and a co-author from Deloitte published an article in Harvard Business Review about what I think is the most interesting thing happening in AI today. It's called How Generative AI is Changing Creative Work. And it's about these, I don't know, some people call them large language models, although now they're for much more than language. Some people call them foundation models. I think generative AI is, to me, the best term. But, they can be trained on a wide variety of content types, and they can generate in a very impressive way another wide variety of content types. So, you can train it on emails, you can train it on websites, you can train it on images, etc., and it will produce with only a short prompt, quite impressive paragraph, or produce an image, or produce a video, or produce a blog post, or, for us content creators, it's a little scary to see how this might evolve over time.
Well, my next question comes from Hamid Adib of Connecticut, and Hamid writes, what is the optimum solution to keep bias out of AI and machine learning?
Well, that's a very good question. It's a very challenging issue because bias results from data, the data we use to train these models. Data only comes from the past. The past typically involved human decision making about, who to hire or who to give a loan to or whatever. And humans are very biased. So it's a big issue. Sometimes we think that bias is okay. Like, for example, if I were to apply today for a long-term care insurance policy, mine would be less expensive than my wife's, and one could argue that's a case of gender bias, because we men tend to live shorter lives than women do. Is that bias, or is it just the way the world works? So it's a complex issue. I think really there are companies that have produced software that will identify potential types of bias, which groups may suffer as a result of applying or deploying this particular model. It's sometimes hard to know beforehand, before you have any sort of outputs or predictions, just because the models that are increasingly used to make these predictions aren't very transparent. They may have hundreds or thousands of different variables or features, and not be very interpretable, even by a data scientist. So
Mhm.
I think we're making slow progress, and you can at least look at, okay, which features tend to be the most influential in these models, but it's still in part at least, a human activity to say, okay, who suffers from the use of this particular model, and can we live with that? Can our customers live with that? Is this something that is an acceptable form of bias that we've been using for decades, like the insurance one I mentioned?
Hmm. Well, this last question comes to us from Ian Sharp of Sydney, Australia, and I think it ties to the question Hamid just asked: is what safeguards should organizations put in place as part of machine intelligence design to help ensure appropriate and legally defensible decision outputs by the AI?
Yeah, well, I'm very interested in that. And I have a new book coming out in January called All In on AI, where I talk about companies that are really aggressive in their use of AI.
Mhm.
And most of them, I would say, they say, we care a lot about ethical AI, AI fairness, et cetera, responsible AI. But they've created policies, but they haven't really, the rubber hasn't really hit the road yet in terms of day-to-day governance. But I do talk about Unilever in
Mhm.
this book, and they now, for every use case that somebody wants to develop, if you want any sort of corporate resources at all, or really if you want to even introduce this into the marketplace, you have to send them the description of what the use case is going to be about. And they don't evaluate it internally. They have an external partner called Holistic AI,
Mhm.
which looks at it both, with human eyes and also with various automated sorts of assessment tools to say, is this likely to be biased? Is it transparent? Is it likely to be effective? I mean, some of the proposals that come in are not likely to work very well. Some people think that AI can do more than it really can,
Yeah.
so they might come back and say, well, it would be fine ethically, it's just not going to work very well. And I think just as we do that for financial performance in public companies anyway, we'll probably end up having external auditors. My friends in Deloitte and the other big four companies say, well, we can't really audit it yet because there are no government standards.
Yeah.
But we're moving in that direction, and Europe has an AI Act that's not implemented fully yet, but I think there will be progress in that regard, and maybe we'll have official criteria by which companies will be able to audit the performance of their AI use cases.
That's interesting. And I don't we don't have time to unpack it today, but I think that opens up all kinds of freedom of speech and all kinds of different and interesting discussions. Like whose bias are we talking about? Like who gets to decide who are the arbiters of what is true and ethical?
Oh no, we all agree on what's truth in this society, Paul. Just kidding. Um, and those generative AI systems are also going to be very controversial in terms of, one, they'll be able to generate deep fakes, I think, quite easily, and
Yeah.
two, who owns the intellectual property? There's already a lawsuit against one of the tools that Microsoft has introduced that generates code,
Mm.
because it scrapes existing code in order to come up with automated code generation. And so this is the GitHub business unit. They have a tool called Copilot, and they've already been sued, even though it's just introduced to the marketplace a month or two ago.
That's interesting. I don't know why, but that reminds me of like record sampling and like how that
Yeah,
emerged like in
exactly.
the late 80s, early 90s with groups like the Beastie Boys, and suddenly it was like, well, whose music is it? But anyway.
Yeah, same idea.
Well, Tom, thank you so much. This has been a fascinating discussion, and congratulations on the new books, and also, obviously all the material that you're putting out this fall. So, data product strategy, fascinating. Data product manager. So, kids, get your resumes together, and if any universities are out there listening, it sounds like we have a new potential new job market to train up for. So I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely.